Listen, the never Trump. I'll break it down to a couple of Syria, Lagos has become one of the largest exporters of illegal ivory in the world.
Live in a third world nation where your votes will get stolen if you can vote for it at all.
Hello, welcome to Around the World with Dane Waters. I'm your host, Dane Waters. I'm all choked up today, choked up today. Anyway, I'm actually messaging my guest. Modern technology is so great that, time changes. The problem with this show, no, there's no problem with this show. One of the challenges of this show is the fact when you talk to people in different time zones, you always have to coordinate and do all that kind of stuff. So it's always interesting. Anyway, so what's going on around the world? Today we're going to be talking about the craziness in the UK. It's getting, you think American politics is crazy. Well, we have to talk about the UK politics. We'll talk about that's number one. Number two, Iran. I mean, it's constantly. I mean, Donald Trump has dug himself a hole, and we will talk about that shortly as well. What's going on with that. But I do want to go back and talk about because I do look forward to having on the show in the future guests to talk about the future pandemics. I mean, we saw what happened to the hantavirus on the ship. Actually, a Spanish person was just diagnosed. The incubation period from that ship is 3 weeks, so they're expecting this week that more people will be diagnosed with it. Then we have the Ebola outbreak, what's happening in Africa, in the DCR. And this is one of the things. This is one of the problems with reducing the amount of global aid that America gives and that the other European countries give. Is it makes these things possible. I mean, I know people think that, okay, country gives aid, it doesn't benefit them, but it does. Listen, if there's an outbreak of Ebola in a country, the international community needs to be concerned about that. And so we can't reduce this funding. I'm really choked up. So anyway, so that's going on. Today is a major election in Texas as far as a runoff between Cornyn and the Republican primary between Cornyn and Paxton. That will set the tone for the November election between Tallarico, who's the Democrat. Donald Trump came out and endorsed Paxton, so we'll see if Paxton can win. We'll probably have Ajike Okpa on, who's a Texan. I'll have him on soon to talk about that. And it's just a world that's in flux. And one thing I'll say about the Iran conflict before we take a break here, and that is that all of the conversations about opening the Strait of Hormuz, all the conversation seems to be about, Iran charging a toll or not charging a toll. None of this with the Strait of Hormuz was an issue prior to the conflict. None of it. Strait of Hormuz was working perfectly fine. Ships were going in and out. There were no tolls. And so now America is working very hard, and they're very proud of the fact that they're going to open up the Strait of Hormuz. Well, the reality is the Strait of Hormuz was open before this conflict ever started, and there were no issues. I don't know. It's crazy. Anyway, so let's take a quick break from Around the World with Dane Waters, and we will be back with our first guest. Thank you.
What we've always maintained, listen, the never Trump. I'll break it down to a couple of Syria, Lagos has become one of the largest exporters of illegal ivory in the world.
Live in a third world nation where your votes will get stolen if you can vote for it at all.
No. You dress yourself, So no, you look good. You're always a handsome man in the morning, so all good.
Thank you. I try.
Look, I'm back. Around the World with Dane Waters. I'm sitting here and I'm just looking at my phone. That was a quick. Well, we're joined today with Saul Sadka. Hey, Saul, how are you, sir? Good
Great
to see you.
Dane.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the Middle East, talk about Iran, talk about Israel, Lebanon. Okay, it's such a complicated mess. So let me just start with this question. What do you make of what's currently happening between the United States and Iran?
What I think is happening really is there is a game of chicken. And the end of this will be, one way or another, that the Iranians will not have their nuclear material. Otherwise, they simply won't have any economy, one way or another, if that's because the sanctions will continue for too long. or because the economy will effectively be removed by strikes, one way or another. So they're going to have to compromise on that soon enough. That's my guess of what will probably happen. Once that happens, the regime inevitably will collapse because without that nuclear material, they don't really have a core telos to rally around. That's what's been keeping them together for 47 years. If it hadn't been for that nuclear material as well, for example, if they have another uprising, which seems to happen in Iran once every 2 years or so, the next time that inevitably happens, well, the reason that the foreign enemies of Iran, which are now far more numerous than they used to be even 6 months ago, because they've attacked all their enemies, they've attacked all their neighbors who were ostensibly allies. Even they would attack them if they would try, for example, to kill another 40,000 protesters. The only reason that didn't happen to them last time is because they had the terrifying prospect of a nuclear breakout on the table. That's not really there anymore. And once the uranium is gone, it's not there at all. So at that point, you would have to assume that the regime will no longer be able to stand in the face of its people.
Okay, so okay, yeah. Well, listen, I want regime change as badly as the next person. So, I mean, I really think that we need to find a way to make it fall. And I was supportive of the conflict early on from the standpoint of regime change and making sure that, just like the rest of the world, Iran does not have access to a nuclear weapon. Um, but I mean, so let me ask you this: the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu. It seems like, I know yesterday Netanyahu announced that the Prime Minister of Israel announced that taking greater action against Hezbollah and Lebanon. Do you think that that the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu is strained now because of delaying conflict in Iran, or what's your take on that?
We suddenly are seeing stories that the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu is strained. But if you recall, in June last year, before Israel attacked, and in late February this year, before the second attack, the war that's now started, we saw those same stories in the press. In fact, you saw those same kind of stories put out by the very same journalists who we don't need to name, saying, oh, Trump and Netanyahu have fallen out. Trump is taking control of the situation. And so the same exact stories from the same exact journalists, and each time those precipitated a major change in strategy, be that strategy a renewed war or be that a renewed peace. So of course it does seem that what's happening here is you have what is can only be described as a Russian doll of ruses. So what's critical for Israel and the United States, if, for example, they were to return to the fight right now at some point soon, which is very likely. In fact, it happened last night to some extent.
Yeah.
Was absolutely critical for them. And we don't know what happened last night, by the way. It's entirely unclear. It could be the strikes that Iran last night were absolutely devastating. We'll only find out about that in months to come. But leaving that aside, in order to have such an attack, more than anything, what they need is surprise. Now, how do you have surprise in a situation where you're arrayed against your enemy all in every direction, all around their borders? So it's very hard. What you have to do is constantly keep them guessing, constantly giving them the impression, for example, that if you are about to attack, then actually you're about to make peace, that you're ready to make peace with them almost at any terms, that you're desperate for a peace deal, that you're fighting the allies and bickering with each other. That's exactly the kind of thing that you would give. For example, you would send your Secretary of State, who was known to be more hawkish, off to India, and you would call in your Vice President, who was known to be generally in opposition to foreign entanglements, closer to you. You would do all these things, and these are all the things that they did last night. For example, if what happened seems to have happened actually did happen, and the Israelis joined the Americans in attacking Iran, although it's entirely unclear, it would make sense, of course, that the Israelis would do two things. It's exactly what they did the previous time. First of all, they know that there are people in Israel who potentially might be sending information out, either innocently because they're not that smart, and so they send photographs of airplanes parked on the tarmac and so on, or they would see Netanyahu's cavalcade and take a photo of it. This is stuff that kind of happens, but there also could be sinister actors who are low-key providing information to Iran about critical infrastructure and the movements of VIPs. It's very likely that's the case. But even if you were only suspicious that's the case, what you would do, first of all, is you would do exactly what the Israelis did last night. In the middle of the night, at about 11 p.m. Israel time, a very strange statement was put out to say that Netanyahu was in a hospital in the middle of the forest near Jerusalem having his teeth repaired. It's a very strange time to get your teeth repaired, but that, for example, could be a cover story to explain why Netanyahu was heading out at an unusual hour to an unusual location, which I would assume would be some kind of war bunker, which would obviously the location would be highly classified. But it might, for example, be in the same direction as the hospital. Likewise, of course, what did the Israelis suddenly decide they were going to do after a few weeks of relative calm in the north? They announced that tonight, last night, there was going to be a large strike on Lebanon, that they've had enough. They were suddenly going to start attacking Lebanon much more strongly. Why would you do that? Because in Israel and in the neighboring countries, it's hard, it's a small area. It's hard to get 200 airplanes that you would need to attack Iran up into the air without everyone in the country noticing that there are jets flying overhead far more than usual. So that's the kind of thing that you would do. If, for example, you were trying to surprise Iran, my guess is that everything that's been happening over the past week, all the back and forth, is presenting Iran with an option. It's essentially telling them that they have to sign the piece of paper that Trump is offering them. And that piece of paper might be a 30-day truce or a 60-day truce, during which time they have to figure out how they're going to get that nuclear dust, as Trump calls it, that he wants out of the country. That is Trump's real only red line. And if at the end of that period they haven't managed to sign on a deal, a formal final deal, then again he will probably go back to strikes. And he was very clear that during that period, all the American equipment will be staying in the region and even building up, because he wants to keep that gun pointed at the IRGC's temple. That's his plan. He is trying to force Iran to sign a deal, first a temporary truce, but ultimately a long-term peace and the return of the uranium. He is trying to force them to sign this deal with a gun pointed to their head. And as time has continued over the past 2 months of the ceasefire, he has been building up, he has been chambering bullets more and more in that gun to the point where he now has a cannon pointed at their head. And he can shoot that cannon at any time.
Well, let me ask. So let's take this. Let me ask this basic question: if Trump agrees to the 60-day truce that's being discussed, or a 60-day memorandum of understanding, where he says, okay, we'll open up the Strait of Hormuz immediately, and then we'll take 60 days to decide what to do with the nuclear dust, as he calls it, and all this kind of stuff. Will the Israelis be happy with that decision?
I think that would be, well, look, you have to look at it. There are different kinds of Israelis here. So on the one hand, you have Israelis who have been told that the goal of the war is to completely destroy the IRGC and to completely destroy Hamas and completely destroy Hezbollah. However, from a strategic point of view, it's not necessary at all for Israel to totally destroy those enemies. It's simply enough to attrit them to the extent that they no longer pose a strategic threat to Israel. So, for example, Hamas has been dealt with largely. There is now a wide 5 kilometer or so buffer zone between Israeli civilians and the nearest Hamas fighter, whereas 2.5 years ago, there were at least 7 or 8 times as many Hamas fighters, and they were far better armed, and the barrier between them and Israeli civilians was a wire fence. So the situation with Hamas, while Hamas still exists and it still controls approximately 2 million or so Arabs in the Gaza Strip, they no longer pose a threat to Israel. Hamas has become a Gazan people's problem. Likewise in Lebanon. While Lebanon poses a very small threat, they can shoot a few drones and a few rockets at Israel's far northern communities. The threat that Hezbollah posed 2.5 years ago was a strategic one to Israel. They had 10,000 to 20,000 armed men who were literally trained on a suicide mission to breach across the border into Israel and kill anyone they could. That was what was standing on Israel's border 2 years ago. None of that exists. The Hezbollah still exists. They still have the ability to harass Israel on the border, which is why Israel has occupied nearly 700 square kilometers of Lebanese territory and is currently removing any kind of weaponry they can find there. But also, they can harass the people of Lebanon. They can bother the people in Lebanon. They can cause them problems, and they're ruining their lives. They've ruined their economy. Lebanon is now the third most miserable place to live in the world after only Afghanistan and Yemen. Lebanon could be a paradise. So we're now getting back to the IRGC. So for the IRGC, the same applies. The question for Israel on a strategic level, does it need to destroy the IRGC, or does it simply need to reduce it to the point where it is no longer a threat to Israel, to the point where it becomes a problem only for the people of Iran and perhaps for the people that directly abut Iran? So from a cynical perspective, from the cynical Israeli perspective, yes, that's enough. Iran no longer poses a significant threat. Any attempts that it makes to rebuild its nuclear program, its missile program, its drone program, the drone program never really affected Israel anyway. They didn't manage to get a single drone through to Israel. Its proxy networks can't be built up. Any attempts that it makes will be attrited faster than they can rebuild it. And if you can attrit them faster than they can rebuild, they are no longer a strategic threat. So then you have to ask, is Israel motivated to do the very difficult job of trying to change the regime in Iran? Well, on a moral level, they are. Netanyahu certainly might be, because Netanyahu, of course, has elections in 5 months. And if he could, I mean, his achievements since the October 7th attack are quite astounding. On October 8th, he did say he was going to revolutionize the situation in the Middle East, and he has inarguably done that. And he can come to those elections with a very neat trick, which is Khomeini's shriveled head on a pike. But it would be even better for him.
But Saul, let me ask this question. I mean, so let's go back to that. So yeah, he can ask for. I just watched Game of Thrones, and I'm well aware of the putting the heads on the spike thing. So it's it's definitely. But let's talk about, okay. So but if Trump makes a deal, if President Trump makes a deal, okay, where it basically leaves the regime intact, 60 days to work on these issues, as you said, Netanyahu has an election in 5 months. Will Netanyahu respect the deal that Trump makes, or will Israel continue to try to do things on their own terms? If they feel that Iran is still, and the IRGC is still doing whatever they want to do?
I think certainly while the current regime is in place in Israel, the current government, and certainly while Trump is in town, that Israelis will do nothing without Trump's permission. That doesn't mean that they won't attack Iran, because it could be that they won't simply have permission. A deal between the United States and Iran doesn't necessarily bind the Israelis. And if the Israelis feel threatened, they might go to Trump and say, listen, you made a deal, but we want to continue attacking. And Trump may or may not agree to that. It's unknowable. But the truth is that as long as the deal includes the return of the nuclear material and the ability to rebuild it, the centrifuges and so on, Israel has achieved its goals. Netanyahu, like I said, might not personally have achieved his goals, but that's enough for Israel. And eventually it will be enough for the Iranian people as well, because without that nuclear equipment, the Iranian regime don't have the ability to turn themselves into North Korea, which was their goal. You're never going to see revolution in North Korea, and if you did, it would be immediately crushed. And the reason is because there's nobody in the world who, for the sake of the 20 to 25 million Korean people who live under Kim Jong-il, are willing to risk their own militaries, or are willing even to get attacked with nuclear weapons to try and overthrow that regime. No matter what he does, even if the North Korean regime would set up concentration camps, no one is going to go in there and attack them, because they don't want to get their cities turned into ash. So the fact that the Iranians will now never have nuclear weapons, and a deal that will actually make that permanent and confirm that, should be enough for the Israelis. I would think that will keep them happy. However, of course, it's not enough for the Iranian people. It's not enough for the Iranian exiles. And most of all, it's actually not enough for the Gulf countries. The situation between the Gulf countries and Israel regarding Iran has absolutely reversed in the past few months. Whereas a few months ago, it was the Gulf countries who wanted always to try and make some kind of connotation with Iran, because they recognized that while Iran was a great threat, the process of getting rid of the IRGC was going to cost them lots of money. As we have seen, has exactly happened. They were correct. The Israelis didn't care that it was going to cost lots of money, because they understood that it was a strategic threat to them. But of course, now that this has continued now for a few months, the Straits of Hormuz are closed, the UAE and the Saudis are building bypasses to get the oil out, to get all their materials out, and that will essentially make the Straits of Hormuz irrelevant within a year or two. So if this continues for a year or two, the Straits of Hormuz have become irrelevant. But those two countries, for example, understand now, and Qatar more than anyone, Qatar is in the worst position because they don't have any way to get their liquefied natural gas out at all without the Straits of Hormuz. They certainly can't make a deal with Iran, and they certainly don't want to make a deal with their tribal rivals in Saudi Arabia. They are not friends. So they're in a very difficult position, these countries. Those countries understand that until such time as the IRGC is absolutely gone, whether the Straits of Hormuz are open or closed, there will constantly be a threat there. And who is really going to want to deal with them to buy their petrochemicals when there's this continual risk that, who knows, maybe in a month or two there'll be a war again and you're not going to get your delivery, when you could buy it from Venezuela or from Guyana or from Africa?
Yeah.
It's
No,
going to
I
put
mean,
them in a very difficult
I
situation.
agree. Well, listen, we got 3 minutes left here. So let me ask this. I have to go to two other quick things. Number one, what do you think of Trump's proposal asking all the countries now to sign on to the Abraham Accords?
My suspicion is that was another part of the ruse to give the impressions that Trump is absolutely obsessed with the idea of making a deal to put the Iranians at ease and sort of lobotomize them. But I think that's obvious. There's an element of truth in this, as we mentioned. The people right now who fundamentally need to be most hawkish about Iran are their immediate neighbors, who they've fired rockets at and destroyed much of their oil infrastructure in response for something they didn't even do. They weren't even involved. Iran just lashed out at them. They are their real enemies now. It is going to be Qatar, whatever Qatar and Saudi Arabia and UAE and Oman and Kuwait, whatever these countries are saying in public, we can safely ignore it. We can safely ignore it, and we can assume, unless they're really not thinking clearly, they are the ones pushing most of all for regime change in Iran, more than anyone.
So okay, and to Netanyahu in the elections. I mean, in 5 months are the elections. Do you believe Netanyahu will be reelected, or will be any serious challenging?
He certainly has a serious challenger in Bennett and the proposed coalition that he's trying to build. The problem for the proposed coalition to Netanyahu is that even if it does manage with the help, perhaps, as it did last time, of one of the small Arab parties to get over the 61 vote threshold that you need to form a coalition, that coalition, as it was last time, this happened 4 years ago too, the coalition managed to last a year, and during that year they had to have two prime ministers. That coalition is ideologically very, very fractured. You would have to include people who are, on the one hand, virtually members, if not actual members of the Muslim Brotherhood, people that are genuinely on the far left, people like Yair Golan, who is essentially as more or less as left as you can go within the Israeli political mainstream. And members of his party, by the way, are even more to the far left. And you would have to have people like Bennett, who in many ways is to the right of Netanyahu. The only reason Bennett put this coalition together 2 years ago was because that was the only way that he himself could personally become prime minister, which was his goal. He essentially took the people that voted for him and gave him 8 seats in the Knesset and shifted them over to set up this leftist, centrist, and right-wing coalition that he built last time. It's not really a sustainable coalition because those people disagree on much more than they agree on. Certainly, it could happen, but if it did happen, it probably wouldn't, like last time, last more than a year or so. The question is Netanyahu going to get to that 61-3 threshold? I would say it's 50-50 at this time, but it depends very much on a few things. It depends on the continuing state of the war, the geopolitics, whether Netanyahu can persuade the people that while he was in charge on October 7th, his actions since have mitigated that failure, or whether the people against him will be able to dispute that. That will really be the crux of the coming election. And my guess is he will probably just squeak over the line. If he does, he will be there for another 4 years until he is turned 80. He is currently 76 years old, because his coalition is going to be a much more stable coalition than any coalition that could be formed against him. So if he loses, the coalition that will replace him will probably be very weak. unless, which is also possible, there is some kind of major shake-up in the Israeli political scene and some new players coming in the next few months.
Is any of this talk about the corruption charges against Netanyahu and whether he should be pardoned or not, does any of that have any political weight these days?
I think the last surveys show that the vast majority of people who are already on his side very much resent that corruption charges against him. They're not considered, even by people in the center, to be serious. These are not corruption charges alleging that he enriched himself to any great degree. They are, and they have all sorts of strange cruxes, issues like cigars and luxury champagne that was gifted to him by friends and Mickey Mouse dolls. All of it looks a little bit silly, and it particularly looks silly to the Israeli public because while Israel is not a corrupt country, they're aware that there is corruption to some level, both within the police and within the political echelons. And what seems to be happening to Netanyahu from a general public perspective looks to be almost a witch hunt, only because the topics of the accusations seem to be so trivial, and yet the case is dragging on now for more than 10 years. It doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't seem to make sense, for example, that there are literally hundreds of days of witness testimony about cigars and champagne, and whether or not he was getting good press in one of the local newspapers. So the people don't seem to like it in general, particularly in the center and on the right. I don't think that's going to have a factor anymore. Last surveys I saw, most people supported Trump's own idea that the president of Israel should pardon him, which he is not doing. I don't think it will be a major issue in the election. That's already baked in. Everyone knows the stories already. And he's been elected 4 times since those prosecutions began.
Right. Okay, let's talk about Lebanon again real quick. So, what do you think the ultimate goal and what do you think is going to happen in Lebanon between Israel and Lebanon?
The ultimate goal for Israel is to clear an area along the border such that Lebanon can no longer be used as a launching pad for terror against Israelis. That's the core goal. That's what they're up to right now. They will, I've no doubt, achieve that. It's not a hard goal. Hezbollah is extremely weak at the moment. They are not really putting up much resistance, a few drones here and there, a few rockets. They are dying. The Hezbollah fighters are being knocked out from the obituaries that we're seeing posted on Facebook. There are people that record the obituaries are being knocked out at a rate of at least 70 or 80 to 1 for every Israeli fighter that they have. And considering that Hezbollah is down to its last 10,000 men at most, that's obviously not a sustainable pace of loss for them. They certainly won't be able to train replacements in time to fight the Israelis in the long run. And they are also drawing from a shrinking population pool, since so many Shia Muslims in Lebanon, which is that's their constituency. You're only talking about a pool of a couple of 100,000 fighting age males, and many of them have already left and no longer live in Lebanon. The ones that wanted to fight stayed, and the ones that didn't want to get drafted into the Hezbollah army are living in Belgium, they're living in Michigan, they're living all over Africa, they're living in South America. So they have a very limited pool of talent available to continue their martyrdom, their completely wasteful attacks on Israel that really only lead to what they call martyrdom for their fighters.
And I guess so. What you see the ultimate in Israel is that the Israelis will probably occupy everything south of the Litani River, stay there, like build a buffer zone like they did in Gaza. So honestly, as far as the Lebanese are concerned, Israel will occupy that area and has no intentions of leaving, in your opinion, right?
I think yes. I don't think they will occupy the entire area to the Litani. I think they're going to draw a more complex line. I don't think the Israelis have any plans of occupying the city of Tyre, for example, with its population of 40,000. I don't think it needs to. I think more likely it will simply might expand its buffer zone somewhat, but not much. It will certainly expand to certain parts north of the Litani as well. If it wants to eradicate the entirety of Hezbollah in South Lebanon, it does have the ability to do that. And who knows, it might keep pushing forward and do so. And once they reach the Litani, they would have removed and control effectively the vast, vast majority of Hezbollah infrastructure within that area. That's where most of the Shia Muslims in southern Lebanon live. There's another river, another 10 kilometers north called the Awali, if I recall. If the Israelis reached that river, they would essentially occupy the entire Shia heartland of Lebanon. And if they did that, that really would effectively completely stop Hezbollah from attacking Israel. It wouldn't be able to meaningfully attack except with long-range rockets, which they don't have many of, and Israel can easily intercept. So if that would happen, that would be a very beautiful thing for Lebanon, even though it would be painful because Israel would have to cause the evacuation of another few 100,000 people that live there. But once Israel could demilitarize that zone, and if it could be demilitarized and handed over to some kind of third-party force that would ensure its perpetual demilitarization, not the completely useless United Nations force that's been there for 25 years, and which allowed Hezbollah under its noses to build up tunnels and arsenals. All that stuff is the reason why southern Lebanon looks like it does. If the Israelis are able to push Hezbollah completely out of southern Lebanon, which is quite a task, but they are, I would say, halfway there, then things could look very different for Lebanon. Because once Hezbollah is too weak to control Lebanon, they are no longer a threat to Lebanon, and the Lebanese people can be free. They can have a normal government that isn't involved with terrorism. They can have international treaties. They can make peace with Israel, and they can go from being the third most miserable place in the world, by all accounts, to one of the happiest places in the world. They have beautiful coastline. They have skiing. They have a reputation for being great hosts in tourism. They have a reputation for banking. Lebanon can be a very rich country once Hezbollah is gone. It doesn't seem, however, that they have the ability themselves to remove them. And if Israel does stop in that buffer zone, which does seem likely, and doesn't continue to wipe out Hezbollah in other parts of the country, it does seem that the Lebanese army and the government there either don't have the will or the ability to remove that final remnant of Hezbollah, which means that Hezbollah will be with them forever. But that's not the end of the world for Israel, because at that point they are, as we said, a Lebanese people's problem. They won't really be able to hurt Israel anymore.
No, listen, I agree with you. Listen, Hezbollah is the cancer on Lebanon. Lebanon is an amazing country, as you're talking about. It has great potential, but as long as Hezbollah is there, it won't reach that potential. Listen, Saul, it's always a great pleasure. I really appreciate you being on the show. Sadly, we're out of time,
Dane,
and
it's
I
so
will
great
be
speaking
back
to
in
you.
touch. I will be back in touch soon. Thanks.
Thank
Let's take
you.
a quick break from Around the World with Dane Waters, and we'll be back with our next guest. Thanks, Saul.